So if you watch the previous video, you'll see that I finished this table, or not finished the table, but filled out some of the rows in this table. And I'm going to use these ideas, these actions against advertisers and companies, to go ahead and make a body paragraph. If you have been able to watch the video I made about pi paragraph formation, I do recommend watching that. It might reiterate some of the things I've mentioned or that you've learned before about writing. And the gist of it, kind of general idea, is that when you're writing, when you write paragraphs, what you're going to do is you're going to have a point, information, and explanation. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that in this video because I have that whole video dedicated to that, but I am going to use these 3 points to make a paragraph about actions against advertisers and companies. And one reason I'm starting with body paragraphs is that I think that can be one of the easier places to start, but rather than starting with your introduction at first. And based on the ideas that really emerge from the text, that really come through from what you're reading, you can structure your other ideas around that and your main thesis statement around that. So I am taking this row, so actions against advertisers and companies. I just took it and I copied it into this document where I have this information about from the 4 different articles. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to make kind of this choppy paragraph that is going to be a good rough draft, a good starting point. So let's go ahead and start out by saying one more time, I'm going to look at that. So there have been a lot of actions taken against advertisers. And I think this isn't a bad place to start. I think that as I develop my other paragraphs, as I develop my thesis statement, it might make more sense to go back and figure out, add some more language to this initial sentence. But for now, I think that's a good place to start. So there have been a lot of actions taken against advertisers. For example, when companies like Goodyear tried to sponsor the Smithsonian, their sponsorships were eventually canceled due to public outcry. And because we didn't come up with this idea all on our own, this came from the Ruskin and Shore article. So it's Ruskin and Shore, and the year on that, give me just one sec, I'm going to look that up, is going to be, and if you don't have that information right away, one thing you can do is you can just come back to it later. But Ruskin and Shore, their article, Every Nook and Cranny, came out in 2005. So I can put that there. I've got my proper APA citation for that point. I've got that. And you can think about, look at your other examples. So that example came from this column right here. You can also think about, let me see how I could maybe think about how to include Sifferlin. So another case where we can see backlash against the advertising industry was outlined in Sifferlin's, let's see, 2013 article, Let's Move, but not with Shaq and Beyonce. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is that I'm using this another case where we can see backlash. And what's good about that is that it shows, okay, I'm listing this other idea, and you sort of show that you're deliberate about it rather than just saying, listing companies like Goodyear and then and how they got removed from the Smithsonian, and then jumping right into listing about Alexander Sifferlin. I think it's important to have something like these connectors so that you're guiding your reader along. You're not just sort of having them get this information really fast, one after another. So we're not done with that yet. So let's think. We've got an introduction to the example, but we haven't actually listed the example yet. So what we have, I'm going to go ahead and think a little bit, and you can kind of watch my thinking process. So I just said another case where we can see backlash against the advertising industry was outlined in Sifferlin's 2003 article, Let's Move, but not with Shaq and Beyonce. In this article, she outlines how critics picked up on the hypocrisy of celebrities featured in campaigns of celebrities featured in the Let's Move campaign. During the Let's Move campaign, and how they were also spokespeople for sugary soft drinks. So here we have this this other sentence that's giving a little bit more information. And one thing that's important, I think, is that if you are going to include information about what the Let's Move campaign is, then that's fine to just leave it there. But if not, if you don't mention it in a previous article, previous paragraph, or you don't mention it in your introduction paragraph, one thing you're going to need to do is give some information about the Let's Move campaign. So I'm hoping to demonstrate, how this thinking process goes, that it's messy, you have to revise, you have to make a lot of changes along the way. So I'm going to sit and think for just a sec, see how to include that in there. See. So yeah, so featuring the Let's Move campaign, a campaign spearheaded by then First Lady Michelle Obama to promote healthy habits among young people. And so I've added this, and I might have to read it over a time or so because now this is kind of a long sentence and there's a lot going on. So I'm going to try and read it out loud, see if it's still something that I can easily understand. In this article, she outlines how critics picked up on the hypocrisy of celebrities featured in the Let's Move campaign, a campaign spearheaded by then First Lady Michelle Obama to promote healthy habits among young people, and how they were also spokespeople for sugary soft drinks. For me, that sounds okay. The only thing I think that's kind of confusing is this this pronoun they, because I'm referring to celebrities and the celebrities featured in Let's Move campaign, but since then I've introduced a lot of ideas, so it's kind of hard, I think, for my reader to remember what the meaning of they is. So I would say, and how these celebrities were also spokespeople for sugary soft drinks. So that's, not a bad point right there. And I think this article, or this paragraph, one thing that I've done so far is I've included two different instances of two instances of separate articles. So I've met the bare minimum. This would be a little short for a paragraph, but just because I'm showing an example, I'm going to go with writing my explanation, kind of wrapping up the paragraph. So the point, that's sort of the main idea of the paragraph. The information are the examples, the content that supports and demonstrates your main idea, that point. And then the explanation kind of ties everything together. It expresses the significance of these ideas, these examples, and sort of supporting this main idea. So let's kind of bring this all back together. So we've got these examples, and like one thing that is sort of floating to the surface in my head as I'm thinking about it is the Smithsonian and Let's Move campaign. These are things that are generally really good, like the, let's move, like, be exercising, healthy food, like that's good. Smithsonian, it's this renowned museum in the United States that is thought of as this great place of culture. So like these are places that these are things that I think, are generally pretty good, but with advertising, when it gets tied to like these advertisements, these kind of more, less, it feels like they become worse and there's public outcry. So that wasn't what I intended to use in this paragraph, but as I've developed my ideas, as I've, focused on these two examples, that's something that's emerged. So I'm a big fan of using writing to kind of discover your ideas, to get a better sense of what you think you might want to talk about. So I'm going to take a moment and kind of think about how I'm going to write that in my explanation, in the conclusion of my paragraph. So from these examples, we can see how damaging advertising can be for potentially well-regarded things. Things is not a great word, but I'm just going to leave that there. When I come back for proofreading, if I can think of a better word, I'll put it in there. So from these examples, we can see how damaging advertising can be for potentially well-regarded things. The Smithsonian is a well-regarded, and like one thing you want to be careful of is I was just about to say well-regarded. I just used well-regarded there. So that's one thing. Be careful with that. Make sure that you're not repeating the same word. If you want, you can include it there and maybe just highlight it or bold it or something. Make it so you can come back to it later and maybe come up with a different synonym. So you can, I'm going to try and say this a different way. Is thought of as a beacon of culture and history in the United States. So I'm trying to think of how to connect it. And the Let's Move campaign, and the Let's Move campaign had noble goals of promoting healthy lifestyles among children. Yet, when both of these got tied to disreputable advertising practices, sponsored corporate sponsorship and let's see, corporate sponsorship, and I'm trying to think of a way to describe what happened, or very simply describe what happened in the Let's Move campaign. And controversial, maybe it's a little bit strong, but that's good for now. So, so corporate sponsorship and controversial representatives got tied. So yeah, when both of these got tied to disreputable advertising practices, both faced scrutiny and backlash. Had they not engaged in these practices, we likely would have seen better acceptance of both the Smithsonian and the Let's Move campaign. So, kind of based on what's emerged, this idea of that advertising has this negative effect, I'm going to say that, you know what, I'm going to change my topic sentence to better fit the content in the examples, the information, and the explanation. And I also want to point out that I have this explanation that is almost equivalent to the length of the information. So I think it's important. A good explanation can really be what helps your audience understand what you're talking about, and really that thorough analysis, that explanation really is going to help you on the WPA. So I encourage you as much as possible, use your questioning, make sure it makes sense. Think about if you're reading this for the first time without ever having read the articles, does this make sense? Can I understand your ideas? So let's go to the point, and I am going to change that. so that it says something a little bit different. Give me a moment to think about it. All right. Advertising has the potential to public opinion. Advertising, affiliations have to negatively affect public opinion. So this isn't something, so remember, one thing that's important about the paper that you're turning in is this is not something where you're having an opinion. That said, you can still present views that push your reader to decide one way or the other. So you're trying to explain the facts, explain what you've learned from the articles, and present what you've learned and what you know about advertising based on these sources. So this is one thing you can present. So I'm sure there's ways that this is not perfect. I've just spent a few minutes on this and kind of guided you along my thinking process along this journey of writing a body paragraph. So one thing that'll be important is that when I am revising this and writing my introduction, I'm going to need to make sure that it still connects to my thesis. I'm going to need to make sure that when I'm writing my other body paragraphs that it isn't talking about the same thing too much, and that it also there is still some connection. Ideally, if you're writing another body paragraph after this, like say this is your first one, then you'd have maybe some connection, some acknowledgement. So like this, the another case transition is an instance where I said, okay, yeah, there was a case before and here's another case. So if you have questions about how that looks, I'm happy to answer your questions. So let's take a moment and I'm just going to read out loud the paragraph that I wrote. Advertising affiliations have the potential to negatively affect public opinion. For example, when companies like Goodyear tried to sponsor the Smithsonian, their sponsorships were eventually canceled due to public outcry. Ruskin and Shore, 2005. Another case where we can see backlash against the advertising industry was outlined in Sifferlin's 2013 article, Let's Move, But Not with Shaq and Beyonce. In this article, she outlines how critics picked up on the hypocrisy of celebrities featured in the Let's Move campaign, a campaign spearheaded by then First Lady Michelle Obama to promote healthy habits among young people, and how these celebrities were also spokespeople for sugary soft drinks. From these examples, we can see how damaging advertising can be for potentially well-regarded things. The Smithsonian is thought of as a beacon of culture and history in the United States, and the Let's Move campaign had noble goals of promoting healthy lifestyles among children. Yet, when both of these got tied to disreputable advertising practices, corporate sponsorship, and controversial representatives, both faced scrutiny and backlash. Had they not engaged in these practices, we likely would have seen better acceptance of both the Smithsonian and the Let's Move campaign. So, not perfect, but it's a good start. I hope that this insight into my writing process kind of gave you a window into how this is not an easy process, and how sometimes if all you're doing is just, sort of looking at, you can, even if writing doesn't come naturally to you, what you can do is you can follow a certain process and produce something that still works and still is good writing. So I hope this helped, and please let me know if you have any questions.